17-year-old Jessica Dishon had her whole life ahead of her. A senior at Bullitt Central High School in Kentucky, she was a hardworking, kind-hearted teenager who balanced school, a part-time job at Hardee's, and dreams of pursuing a career in culinary arts. Jessica wasn't just another high school student. She was a beloved daughter, a protective older sister, and a young woman filled with potential. Jessica left for school like any other day, or at least, that's what was supposed to happen. But when her mother returned home that afternoon, she found something strange. Jessica's car still in the driveway, her purse, work clothes, and even one of her shoes left inside. Her phone was on the passenger seat, frozen on the number 91. Jessica herself was nowhere to be found. This case would go unsolved for 15 years, haunted by missteps in the investigation, a wrongful arrest, and a dark secret buried within her own family. Welcome to That Police Officer's channel. If you're new here, let me introduce you to what we do. As a police officer, I examine some of the most disturbing, tragic, and complex criminal cases. These are the cases that shake communities, challenge investigators, and remind us of both the darkest and most determined aspects of human nature. Today, our investigation takes us to Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a town that never expected to be the center of such a tragic case. This is the story of Jessica Dishon, a 17-year-old girl whose sudden disappearance set off a desperate search and an investigation that would uncover a devastating truth hidden within her own family. Her sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through the small town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It wasn't like Jessica to run away. Her family and friends knew something was terribly wrong. In the days that followed, the search for Jessica would grip the entire community. But no one could have predicted the horrifying truth that would eventually come to light. On the morning of September 10, 1999, Jessica Dishon's alarm clock rang at 6:45 a.m. It was a Friday, and the 17-year-old high school senior had a routine. She would get ready, grab her things, and leave for Bullitt Central High School around 7:15 a.m. Jessica was responsible and independent. She had worked hard to buy herself a red Pontiac, which she used to drive to school, and her part-time job at Hardee's. Her parents had already left for work, and her two younger brothers, Christopher and Michael, had caught the bus to Bernheim Middle School earlier that morning. Everything seemed normal, but Jessica never made it to school that day. It wasn't until early afternoon that Jessica's mother, Edna Jett, realized something was terribly wrong. Around 1:30 p.m., Edna returned home from work, expecting to see that her daughter had gone about her day as usual. But instead, Jessica's red Pontiac was still in the driveway. At first, it might not have seemed like a reason to panic. Maybe Jessica had decided to stay home. Maybe she had gone with a friend. But as Edna got closer to the car, the scene inside sent chills down her spine. Jessica's backpack was there, untouched. Her work clothes and purse were sitting in the car. A single shoe, one that Jessica had been wearing that morning, was on the driver's seat. Her phone was on the passenger side, the screen displaying the number 91, as if she had been in the middle of dialing for help before something, or someone, stopped her. Confused and worried, Edna called her then-husband, Mike Dishon, and asked him to come home immediately. Together, they began calling Jessica's friends, checking her school, and even stopping by her workplace. But no one had seen her. No one had heard from her. By that evening, the growing fear turned into full-blown panic. Something was wrong. Jessica wouldn't just vanish without telling someone where she was going. Realizing they were out of options, Jessica's parents called the Bullitt County Sheriff's Office after discovering that their daughter was missing, and Deputy David Greenwell was the first officer to respond. His initial instinct was that something wasn't right. The red Pontiac sitting in the driveway, with its contents scattered inside, indicated that Jessica had not left on her own accord. But when Greenwell tried to involve Detective Charles Mann, who was in charge of the investigation, he was dismissed. Detective Mann, at that time, believed that Jessica might be a runaway, and as such, he downplayed the need for an immediate, in-depth investigation. This decision, which would prove to be a huge mistake, delayed a thorough search of the area and, worse, allowed vital time to slip away. 2 days later, the law enforcement began to realize the severity of the situation, especially after Jessica's car remained in the driveway untouched and no one had heard from her. The family, already in a state of panic, went public with their concerns. As the days went by, their worst fears started to surface. Jessica had likely been kidnapped. The sheriff's office now had no choice but to launch a full-scale investigation into Jessica's disappearance. The investigation started with the basics, searching the scene where Jessica was last seen. Her car was found parked in the driveway with signs that something wasn't right inside. But the most important clue was the missing persons report itself. The lack of any phone calls, letters, or signs of Jessica's usual behavior raised alarms. Despite all of this, investigators struggled to gather any physical evidence that could point to a suspect or the location of Jessica. Her car had been left unsecured for days, and the early days of the investigation were filled with missed opportunities. Law enforcement missed potential forensic evidence from her vehicle, which was later realized to have been a major oversight. Over the weekend, while Jessica's parents and community frantically searched for her, her car sat in the driveway, completely unsecured. Family members, friends, and even a television reporter entered the vehicle, potentially contaminating any evidence that might have been inside. The investigation didn't truly begin until Monday morning, after crucial time had already been lost. 17 days after Jessica disappeared, on September 27, 1999, a school bus driver was traveling along Greenwell Ford Road, about 7 miles from Jessica's home. As the driver passed a wooded area, something caught their attention: a body lying just 90 feet from the road. Authorities rushed to the scene, and their worst fears were confirmed. It was Jessica. Autopsy reports later revealed that she had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The details were horrific. Evidence suggested that she had been kept alive for a day or two after her abduction and tortured before being killed. Even more disturbing, investigators determined that her body had been moved just 15 feet to make it visible from the road, possibly up to 18 hours before it was discovered. Someone had wanted Jessica to be found. The crime scene itself offered little in terms of physical evidence. It had been exposed to the elements for over 2 weeks, making it difficult to collect anything conclusive. But one thing was clear: Jessica's murder was deeply personal. Although the body had been exposed to the elements, forensic investigators managed to uncover crucial findings. There was physical evidence of sexual assault, which led investigators to believe that Jessica had been attacked in a brutal and calculated manner. Despite the degradation of evidence, the detectives knew they were dealing with something more than a simple runaway case. In the aftermath of Jessica's murder, law enforcement scrambled to find a suspect. But the early investigation was filled with missteps. The initial belief that Jessica had run away had delayed the response. Her car had been left unsecured, allowing potential evidence to be compromised. And as detectives searched for answers, their focus quickly turned to the wrong man. David "Bucky" Brooks, a neighbor of the Dishon family, became the primary suspect. Brooks, who had a low IQ, gave inconsistent statements when questioned, raising suspicion. There were also rumors that he and his brother had harassed members of the Dishon family in the past. The Brooks brothers began exhibiting strange behavior in the wake of Jessica's disappearance. They repeatedly harassed the Dishon family over the phone, mockingly saying, "Please don't kill me. Please don't kill me." Their erratic actions drew suspicion, and when questioned, Bucky Brooks made conflicting statements about his whereabouts on the morning Jessica vanished. Initially, Bucky claimed he had seen Jessica that morning as he worked on his family's farm and watched her get into her car. However, he later changed his story, stating that he hadn't seen her at all. His inconsistencies raised red flags for investigators. When subjected to a polygraph test, Bucky failed miserably, further deepening suspicions. With no solid alibi, a failed polygraph, and an ever-changing account of events, law enforcement had little else to go on. In 2001, 2 years after Jessica's murder, Brooks was charged with kidnapping and murder. But the evidence against him was weak. Investigators relied heavily on circumstantial details, and many of their leads failed to hold up under scrutiny. The trial in 2003 ended in a mistrial after a detective improperly mentioned that Brooks had failed a polygraph test, something that is inadmissible in Kentucky courts. With no solid evidence linking Brooks to the crime, the case fell apart, and Jessica's murder remained unsolved. The forensic evidence collected from Jessica's body provided valuable insights into what had happened during the last hours of her life. DNA analysis revealed signs of sexual assault, and the injuries to her body were consistent with a prolonged attack. The strangulation marks suggested that her killer had used a method of suffocation, possibly to prevent her from screaming. This evidence told detectives that Jessica's murder was personal, and it seemed that whoever had taken her had intentionally left these signs behind. Despite the damage to the body due to the exposure to the elements, forensic experts managed to collect enough evidence to indicate that Jessica had been killed somewhere else, and her body moved to the location where it was found. One of the most significant pieces of forensic evidence was the shoe left in Jessica's car. DNA on the shoe would later tie it to a male suspect, but that link wasn't made until many years later. At the time of the initial investigation, this lead went nowhere. For over a decade, Jessica Dishon's case remained a haunting mystery in Bullitt County, Kentucky. In 2013, a significant breakthrough emerged when retired Louisville detective Lynn Hunt, known for her dedication to solving cold cases, took a renewed interest in Jessica's unsolved murder. Lynn Hunt built an impressive career, rising to the rank of commander in the Sex Crimes and Elder Abuse Unit before being tasked with reorganizing the forensic division of the Cold Case Unit. In August 2012, she retired from the department, but just 3 months later, she took on a new role with the Bullitt County Sheriff's Office, once again specializing in sexual abuse cases and cold case investigations. When Hunt joined the department, there were 5 unsolved cold cases. Given the complexity and history of Jessica Dishon's case, she made the decision to save it for last. Determined to uncover the truth, Hunt meticulously reviewed the case files, re-examined evidence, and conducted fresh interviews. Her persistence led her to a new lead. An inmate at the Kentucky State Penitentiary claimed to have information about the case. On September 30th, 2013, Hunt interviewed the inmate, who revealed that he had shared a cell with Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle. According to the informant, Stanley had confessed to abducting Jessica, holding her captive for several days, and ultimately taking her life. Stanley allegedly mutilated her body to mislead investigators into believing that drug dealers or the mafia were responsible. The motive, as recounted by the informant, stemmed from Stanley's jealousy over Jessica's relationship with a boy her own age, leading him to refer to them with derogatory terms. While informant testimonies can be unreliable, this inmate's account provided specific details that warranted further investigation. Notably, he mentioned that some of Jessica's personal belongings were hidden under a fallen tree near the crime scene. Driven by this lead, Hunt, accompanied by Jessica's brother, Michael, embarked on a search in the area. After hours of digging in the rain and excavating numerous holes, they decided to inspect a nearby barn where Jessica and her friends used to gather. Inside, they discovered material resembling Jessica's bedsheet. Upon returning to the Dishon residence, they confirmed that the sheet was missing from her bed, strengthening the connection to Stanley. Further investigation into Stanley Dishon's background revealed a disturbing history of abuse within the family. Interviews indicated that Stanley had resided intermittently with various siblings since his teenage years, during which he allegedly abused multiple family members. This pattern of behavior painted a grim picture of a predator operating undetected within his own family. Stanley Dishon's own daughter had also been sexually abused by him, and she later gave a statement to authorities that helped corroborate the allegations. Detectives began to piece together how Stanley had been in the area when Jessica disappeared. They also found that he had a clear motive. He had been grooming his niece for some time before the murder. The arrest and confession. In 2015, after a long and complicated investigation, Stanley Dishon was arrested for the murder of his niece. The case had taken many years to solve, but the pieces finally fell into place. Stanley, overwhelmed by the evidence, ultimately confessed to the crime. In his confession, Stanley admitted to abducting Jessica, assaulting her, and then strangling her. He also revealed how he had hidden her body and moved it before it was discovered weeks later. The nature of the confession was enough to bring closure to the Dishon family, but it also left them shattered. After years of uncertainty and heartbreak, the truth about Jessica Dishon's murder finally came to light. But an arrest was just the beginning. Now, the justice system had to do its part. When investigators gathered enough evidence to move forward with an arrest, Stanley Dishon was taken into custody and formally charged with Jessica's murder. Alongside the murder charge, he was also charged with rape and kidnapping, as evidence indicated that Jessica had been held captive and assaulted before her death. His arrest didn't just reopen the wounds of Jessica's case. It also forced law enforcement to confront past failures. The fact that an innocent man, David "Bucky" Brooks, had been suspected for years while the real killer was within the victim's own family raised serious concerns. As the case moved forward, prosecutors prepared to seek justice for Jessica. They had his confession, but they needed to ensure that he was held fully accountable for his crimes. The prosecution built its case around several key pieces of evidence. Stanley Dishon's confession, in which he admitted to kidnapping, assaulting, and murdering Jessica, was central to their argument. Witness testimonies, including statements from his own family members who had suffered abuse at his hands, helped establish his violent history. Forensic evidence also indicated that Jessica had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Prosecutors argued that Stanley had been preying on young girls for years and that Jessica had become his target. They presented a disturbing history of abuse that stretched far beyond Jessica's case, showing that he had used threats and manipulation to control his victims. The most powerful testimonies came from family members who had suffered abuse from Stanley. Their words painted a picture of a man who had terrorized those closest to him, leaving a trail of victims long before Jessica's murder. Despite the evidence against him, Stanley Dishon's defense attorneys sought to challenge the prosecution's case. Their main strategy was to attack the confession, arguing that it had been coerced or given under pressure. They also pointed out that key physical evidence had been lost or mishandled in the years since Jessica's murder. The defense highlighted the failures of the original investigation, questioning why law enforcement had initially focused on Bucky Brooks and allowed critical evidence to go unchecked. However, their arguments failed to create reasonable doubt. The evidence against Stanley was too strong, and his own words condemned him. One of the most powerful moments came when Jessica's family took the stand to speak about the impact of her death. Her parents, still grieving after all these years, described the unbearable pain of losing their daughter and the agony of not knowing the truth for so long. Another turning point was the testimony of Stanley's other victims. Their statements reinforced the pattern of abuse that had gone on for decades, showing that Jessica's murder was not an isolated act, but rather the final tragedy in a long history of violence. With so much evidence stacked against him, it became clear that there was no way Stanley Dishon could escape responsibility. In 2015, after years of investigation, hearings, and legal delays, Stanley Dishon accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter, rape, and kidnapping in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. For many, the plea deal was frustrating. Given the brutality of the crime, some believe that Stanley should have faced a harsher sentence. But for Jessica's family, the plea deal meant something more. It meant that the case was finally over. After 16 years of pain, delays, and uncertainty, they finally had an answer. Jessica Dishon's murder had a profound effect on her family, the community, and the justice system. For her family, the revelation that her own uncle was the killer was almost unbearable. The betrayal ran deep, and it forced them to confront the painful truth about the dangers that had existed within their own home. For the Bullitt County community, the case was a lesson in the failures of law enforcement. The initial investigation had been flawed, and the wrongful suspicion of Bucky Brooks meant that the real killer had gone unpunished for years. Many people questioned whether justice had been delayed for too long. The case also highlighted the failures in protecting victims of abuse. Stanley Dishon had a history of preying on young girls, and yet, for years, he had been allowed to continue without consequences. The justice system had let him slip through the cracks time and time again, until it was too late. Though justice was finally served, nothing could bring Jessica back. Her family continues to honor her memory, keeping her spirit alive despite the tragedy that took her too soon. Jessica Dishon's story serves as a painful reminder of the importance of justice and the need to protect the vulnerable. While the case was solved, the lessons from it remain, reminding us that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those we least expect.